Sometimes the hardest part of losing everything isn't the loss itself, it's learning to trust again. For 7 years, a woman has lived alone in a mountain cabin, far from the world that once broke her heart. She's built a life of silence and solitude, surviving on her own terms in the wilderness. Then one cold November evening, 2 strangers appear at her door, a rugged mountain man and his young son, seeking shelter from an approaching storm. What starts as one night of hesitant hospitality becomes something none of them expected. Could 3 broken souls find healing in the most unlikely place before we jump back in? Tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Hartwell stood at the window of her cabin, watching the late afternoon light paint the mountain peaks in shades of amber and rose. At 52, her hands bore the marks of 7 years spent working the land alone. Calloused palms, strong fingers, a few scars from careless moments with an axe or saw. Her hair, once a rich chestnut brown, now carried threads of silver that she tied back with a simple leather cord each morning. She'd stopped caring about such things as vanity the day she buried Thomas. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that whispered secrets in the wind. It was a solid structure, built by Thomas's hands 20 years ago when they were young and full of dreams about their life together in the wilderness. 2 rooms, a main living space with a stone fireplace, kitchen area, and her sleeping quarters in the back. The logs were chinked tight against the weather, the roof was sound, and the windows, though few, let in enough light to keep the darkness at bay. She'd chosen this place deliberately after Thomas passed. Not because it was where they'd been happiest, that would have been too painful, but because it was far enough from Pine Ridge that people couldn't easily drop by with their casseroles and their pitying eyes. Far enough that she didn't have to hear the whispers or see the knowing looks that said, "Poor Eleanor, all alone now. What will she do?" What she did was survive. Then after a time she did more than that. She learned to live. Her days followed a rhythm as steady as the seasons. Wake at dawn, stoke the fire, put coffee on to boil. Check the chickens, gather eggs, feed the 2 goats that provided milk and cheese. In spring and summer, tend the garden. Potatoes, carrots, beans, squash, herbs. In fall, preserve everything dry meat, put up jams and pickles. In winter, keep the woodpile stocked, trap small game, and wait for the snow to melt. She'd become a fair shot with the rifle Thomas left her. Had to be. A woman alone in the mountains couldn't afford to miss when a deer presented itself, and she certainly couldn't afford to hesitate if a bear or mountain lion took too much interest in her chickens. The wilderness didn't care about her grief or her gender. It demanded competence, and she'd learned to provide it. The hand-carved rocking chair sat near the fireplace, its wood polished smooth by years of use. Thomas had made it the winter before he took sick, spending long evenings by lamplight with his whittling tools, shaping each piece with care. He'd presented it to her on their 20th anniversary, grinning like a boy. "For when we're old," he'd said, "and all we want to do is sit and watch the fire." They'd never gotten to be old together. She'd been 45 when the fever took him. 3 weeks from the first cough to the last breath. The doctor in Pine Ridge had done what he could, but pneumonia in the mountains was a merciless thing. She'd held Thomas's hand as he slipped away, had whispered promises about being strong, about carrying on. He'd smiled at her, that same gentle smile that had won her heart 30 years before, and told her not to waste her life on grief. She'd tried. But trying and succeeding were different things. The first year after his death, she'd stayed in their home in Pine Ridge, going through the motions. Friends visited, brought food, invited her to socials and church gatherings. Everyone meant well, but their kindness felt suffocating, their concern like a weight pressing down on her chest. She couldn't breathe in that town anymore. Every corner held a memory. The mercantile where Thomas bought her peppermints, the church where they'd married, the tree-lined street where they'd walked on summer evenings. So she'd come here, to this cabin they'd built as a retreat, a place for summers and occasional getaways. She'd sold the house in town, kept only what she could carry or truly needed, and made this her permanent home. People thought she was crazy. Maybe she was. But at least here she could grieve in private. At least here the silence was her own choice. 7 years had passed since then. 7 years of seasons turning, of snow falling and melting, of gardens planted and harvested. 7 years of talking only to herself and the animals, of going weeks without seeing another human face. She made the journey to Pine Ridge twice a year, spring and fall, to trade furs and preserved goods for supplies she couldn't make or grow herself. Flour, salt, sugar, coffee, ammunition, lamp oil. The essentials. The townspeople still worried about her. She could see it in their eyes when she appeared at the trading post, weathered and lean, speaking only as much as necessary to conduct her business. The women would try to draw her into conversation, asking after her health, hinting at church socials or quilting circles. The men would offer to check on her, to make sure everything was all right up at the cabin. She'd politely decline, pay for her goods, and disappear back into the mountains. She told herself she was content. The land provided what she needed. The work kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. In the evenings, she had her books. Thomas had been a reader, and they'd accumulated a modest library over the years. She'd read through every volume multiple times now, could recite passages from memory. On clear nights, she'd sit outside and watch the stars, feeling small beneath their ancient light, finding comfort in the vastness of it all. But if she was honest, and honesty was one luxury of solitude, she knew the difference between contentment and mere existence. She existed. She functioned. She survived each day and moved into the next. But the warmth she'd once known, the simple joy of sharing a meal or a laugh or a moment of wonder with another person, that had been buried with Thomas. She'd convinced herself she didn't need it anymore. Needing things, needing people only led to loss. Better to rely on herself alone. Better to keep the world at a distance where it couldn't hurt her again. November had arrived with its familiar warning signs. The aspens had dropped their golden leaves weeks ago, and the evergreens stood dark against increasingly grey skies. Eleanor had spent the past month preparing for winter, stacking firewood against the cabin wall, checking the roof for any weak spots, storing root vegetables in the small cellar beneath the floor. Her pantry was well stocked with jars of preserved venison, dried herbs, pickled vegetables, and the last of summer's berry preserves. The chickens were in their reinforced coop, safe from predators. The goats had thick coats growing in. She'd made sure of everything, the way she always did. Winter in the mountains demanded respect and preparation. Mistakes could be fatal. This particular evening, she'd noticed the clouds building throughout the day, heavy and dark, rolling in from the northwest. The air had that particular quality it got before a storm, a thickness, a sense of anticipation. The temperature had dropped steadily since noon. By nightfall, she expected snow. Possibly a significant amount given how the wind was picking up. She'd brought in extra wood, filled every water bucket, made sure the animals had plenty of feed. Now, as the sun began its descent behind the mountains, she set about making her supper. Simple fare, pan bread, beans with a bit of salt pork, coffee. She ate alone at the small wooden table, the same table where she and Thomas had shared thousands of meals. Sometimes she set a second place out of habit, then felt foolish and put it away. Tonight she ate from a single plate, her thoughts drifting as they often did in the quiet hours. She thought about Thomas, about the life they'd planned that never fully came to be. They'd wanted children, but it hadn't happened. They'd talked about growing old together, about grandchildren that would never exist, about rocking on a porch and telling stories about their adventures in the wilderness. She washed her plate and cup, banking the fire for the evening. The wind was picking up now, rattling the window panes, whistling through the pines. The first snowflakes began to fall as darkness settled over the mountains. She lit the lamp and settled into the rocking chair with a book, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets that Thomas used to read aloud to her. The storm built quickly, the way mountain storms did. Within an hour, snow was falling thick and fast, driven by gusts that made the cabin creak and groan. Eleanor added another log to the fire, grateful for solid walls and a tight roof. This was the kind of storm that could trap a person for days, that could kill anyone caught unprepared in the open. She was just thinking about heading to bed when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A sound that made her freeze, book forgotten in her lap. Someone was knocking at her door. For a moment she didn't move. Couldn't move. In 7 years, no one had come to this cabin unannounced. No one came here at all except her. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away over rough terrain, and they knew better than to visit without invitation. The knock came again. Steady, patient, but insistent. Not threatening, but definitely there. Eleanor set down her book and stood slowly, her heart beginning to pound. She moved to the door but didn't open it. Through the thick wood, she heard a man's voice, deep and rough, but not unkind. "Ma'am, I apologize for the intrusion. My boy and I were caught in this storm. Saw your lamplight from down the way. We're just asking for shelter until it passes. We won't be any trouble. A child. There was a child out there in this weather." Eleanor's hand went to the door latch, then stopped. Every instinct she'd developed over 7 years of solitude screamed caution. She didn't know these people, didn't know their intentions. A woman alone was vulnerable in ways she'd worked hard to protect against. But a child. In a storm like this, how many of you? She called through the door. "Just 2, ma'am. Myself and my son. He's 9 years old. 9 years old. The age Thomas's child would have been if they'd been blessed with one." Eleanor closed her eyes, took a breath, and made a decision she'd wonder about for the rest of her life. She lifted the latch and opened the door. The snow swirled in immediately, along with a blast of freezing air. Standing on her porch were 2 figures, both covered in snow, both shivering. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard frosted with ice, and eyes that were cautious but kind. He wore a heavy coat and had a pack on his back. Beside him, barely reaching his waist, was a small boy bundled in layers of wool and fur, his face pinched with cold, his eyes enormous in the lamplight. "Thank you." "Ma'am," the man said, his voice rough with cold and relief. "Thank you." Eleanor stepped back, letting them enter. As they crossed her threshold, bringing the storm and the outside world with them, she felt something shift in her carefully constructed solitude. The door that had been closed for 7 years was open now, and 3 lives were about to change, in ways none of them could yet imagine. The boy was shaking so hard his teeth chattered. Eleanor could hear it even over the roar of the wind before she managed to get the door closed and latched again. Snow had blown in across her floor, already beginning to melt in the warmth of the cabin. "Get those wet things off," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. 7 years of talking mostly to herself had left her unused to modulating tone for company. "Both of you. There are pegs by the door." The man nodded, already shrugging out of his pack. As it hit the floor with a solid thump, Eleanor noticed it was well made, but worn, patched in several places. The boy's smaller pack, really just a leather satchel that looked too big for his small frame, came off next. And Eleanor saw it was even more weathered. The leather cracked and faded, the strap mended multiple times with different types of cord. That satchel told a story. It spoke of poverty, of making do, of carrying everything important in one small bag, because that was all you had. Eleanor had seen enough hardship in the mountains to recognize it when it stood in her cabin, dripping melted snow onto her floor. "Come closer to the fire," she said, gentler this time. "You need to warm up slowly, not too fast, or it'll hurt worse." The boy looked up at his father, waiting for permission. The man nodded, and the child moved toward the fireplace with careful steps, as if afraid he might break something or overstep some invisible boundary. Eleanor watched him extend his small hands toward the flames, saw the way his whole body leaned toward the heat, like a plant toward sunlight. In the better light, she could see them both more clearly. The man was perhaps in his mid-40s, weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into distances and weather. His beard was thick and dark, touched with grey, and his hair hung past his collar, tied back with a leather cord. His clothes were practical: wool shirt, canvas pants, sturdy boots, all showing signs of heavy use and careful repair. But it was his eyes that caught Eleanor's attention. They were a deep brown, steady and calm, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. They were the eyes of a man who'd seen hardship, but hadn't let it make him hard. The eyes of a father watching his son warm himself by a stranger's fire, grateful and wary in equal measure. The boy was small for 9, Eleanor thought. Thin, though not starved. His face was all angles and enormous eyes, the same brown as his father's, that took in everything with a quiet, watchful intelligence. His hair was dark and shaggy, badly in need of cutting, and his clothes, while clean, were patched and repatched. But there was something in the way he held himself, a dignity despite the circumstances, that touched something deep in Eleanor's chest. "I'm James McCain," the man said, extending his hand. "Folks call me Bear. This is my son, Samuel." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. His grip was firm, but not aggressive, the handshake of a man who understood the value of respect. "Eleanor Hartwell, this is my cabin. We're grateful for your hospitality, Mrs. Hartwell. We won't impose any longer than necessary. Once the storm passes, we'll be on our way." "It's Miss Hartwell," Eleanor said, then felt foolish for the correction. "Or just Eleanor. And that storm's not passing tonight. Maybe not tomorrow either, by the look of it." She saw the worry flicker across Bear's face before he controlled it. "We have our own provisions," he said. "We won't take your food. I didn't say you would." Eleanor moved to the kitchen area, needing something to do with her hands, something to occupy her besides staring at these strangers who'd invaded her sanctuary. "But you'll both want something hot. I'll make coffee and heat some stew." "Ma'am, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm offering." She pulled out her pot, added water from the bucket, set it on the stove. Her hands were steady, even if her insides felt like they were trembling. "You can accept or not, that's your choice. But the boy looks half frozen, and hot food will help." Samuel's eyes had followed her to the kitchen, and she saw the hunger there, not just for food, though that was present too, but for warmth, for comfort, for the simple kindness of someone caring whether he was cold or hungry. It was a look that reminded her painfully of the children she'd never had, the mother she'd never been. Bear saw his son's expression, and something in his face softened even further. "We'd be grateful," he said quietly. "Thank you." Eleanor ladled out stew that she'd made 2 days ago, venison with potatoes and carrots, seasoned with herbs from her garden. She'd made extra, as she always did, never quite breaking the habit of cooking for 2, even though she ate alone. Now, unexpectedly, she was glad of it. She set out 3 bowls at the table, poured coffee for herself and Bear, and found some chamomile tea for Samuel. The boy looked at the steaming bowl in front of him with something close to reverence. "Go ahead," Bear said softly. Samuel ate slowly, carefully, but Eleanor could see he was hungry. Bear ate too, though he kept watching his son, that protective attention never quite leaving. Eleanor found herself eating without tasting, too aware of the presence of others in her space, the sound of spoons against bowls, the small noises of people sharing a meal. It had been so long since she'd sat at a table with anyone, so long since food meant more than simple fuel for another day alone. "We're headed up to the Morrison trapping camp," Bear said after a while, his voice low and respectful of the quiet. "I guide and trap through the winter months, make enough to get us through until spring." "Samuel travels with me, no wife?" Eleanor asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was too personal, too soon, but Bear didn't seem offended. "She passed 2 years ago. Fever took her quick. It's just been the 2 of us since." "I'm sorry," and she was. She understood that particular grief, the sudden absence of someone who'd been your anchor in the world. "Thank you." Bear glanced at his son, who'd finished eating and was fighting to keep his eyes open. "It's been hard on the boy, but we manage. How far to the camp?" 2 days in good weather. 3 or 4 in this." Bear looked toward the window, where snow was still driving hard against the glass. "We made good time today, thought we could reach the line shack at Copper Creek before dark. But the storm came on faster than expected." Eleanor nodded. She knew the line shack he meant, a small shelter maintained by trappers, about 2 miles from her cabin. In this storm they'd never have made it. Would have frozen to death trying. "You can sleep here tonight," she said, the words coming out before she'd fully decided to say them. "I have some blankets. The floor by the fire will be warm enough. We have our bedrolls," Bear said. "We won't take your blankets." The boy needs more than a bedroll tonight. He needs to warm through properly. Eleanor stood, began gathering what she'd need. Extra blankets from the chest, an old quilt. "You can argue with me or you can let me do what makes sense. Your choice." Bear looked at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw him weighing something. Pride against practicality, independence against his son's well-being. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you. We'll repay your kindness however we can. I don't need repayment. I just need you both to not freeze to death in my dooryard." "That would be poor manners on my part." A ghost of a smile touched Bear's weathered face. "Yes, ma'am." They settled Samuel first, creating a nest of blankets near the fire. The boy was asleep almost before his head touched the makeshift pillow, exhausted by cold and travel and the sudden warmth and food. Bear covered him carefully, tucking the blankets around him with the practiced efficiency of a parent who'd done this countless times. Eleanor watched from across the room, something twisting in her chest. This was what she'd given up when she chose solitude. Not just companionship, but this, the small domestic rituals, the caring for others, the sense of being part of something larger than just her own survival. "He's a good boy," Bear said quietly, settling himself nearby but not too close to his son, his body positioned between Samuel and the door in an unconscious protective gesture. "Gets scared sometimes being out in the weather, but he never complains. Braver than he knows. He's lucky to have you." Eleanor meant it. Whatever else this man was, he was clearly a devoted father. "I hope he'd agree with you. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing right by him, keeping him out here instead of—" Bear trailed off, shook his head. "But that's not your concern. We'll be gone as soon as the storm breaks." Eleanor nodded, but something in her chest felt tight. She moved to her own sleeping area, separated from the main room by only a curtain, and lay down fully clothed, listening to the storm rage outside and the quiet breathing of the strangers in her home. She'd opened her door tonight, let the world back in, just a crack, and lying there in the darkness, listening to a child's peaceful breathing and a father's watchful silence, Eleanor realized something that frightened her more than any storm ever could. She wasn't sure she wanted them to leave. Morning came grey and muted, the world outside wrapped in white. Eleanor woke to unfamiliar sounds, the rustle of someone moving in the main room, the low murmur of a man's voice speaking softly to his son. For a confused moment she thought it was Thomas, that the past 7 years had been some terrible dream, and she was waking to find her husband still alive, still with her. Then reality settled back into place, heavy and familiar. Not Thomas, strangers. 2 people she'd let into her home because a storm was trying to kill them. She rose quietly, splashed water on her face from the basin in her room, and braided her hair. When she pushed aside the curtain, she found Bear already up, stoking the fire while Samuel still slept, bundled in his nest of blankets. "Morning," Bear said, keeping his voice low. "Hope I didn't wake you." "You didn't. I'm usually up before dawn anyway." Eleanor moved to the kitchen area, automatically reaching for the coffee tin. Then she paused, her hand hovering over it. The tin was getting low. She'd planned to make it last until her spring trip to Pine Ridge, rationing it carefully the way she always did. But she had guests, unexpected guests who'd be leaving soon as the storm broke. She measured out the grounds, more generous than she'd been with herself in months. If Bear noticed, he didn't comment, though she saw his eyes follow her movements with quiet attention. "Storm's still blowing," he said, moving to the window. "Hard to tell how much snow we got. It's drifting pretty fierce. But we're probably looking at another day before it's safe to travel." Eleanor nodded, trying to ignore the small flutter in her chest that might have been anxiety or might have been something else entirely. "The animals need tending. I usually do it first thing. I can help with that if you'll allow it." Bear glanced toward his sleeping son. "Once he wakes, Boy can sleep through anything when he's warm and fed. I've managed alone for 7 years. I can manage one more morning. I don't doubt that, Mum. Bear's tone was respectful but firm. But if we're taking your shelter and your food, seems only right we contribute what we can. I'm good with animals and handy with repairs. If something needs fixing while I'm here, I'd be grateful for the work. Eleanor studied him. There was no false pride in his offer, no masculine need to prove himself. Just a man who understood the balance of give and take, who didn't like being beholden without offering something in return. The chicken coop could use some reinforcement on the north side, she admitted. Wind's been getting under the boards there. I patched it, but it needs proper fixing. I can do that. Bear smiled just slightly. After coffee, the coffee was ready, dark and strong, and Eleanor poured 2 cups. She'd forgotten the pleasure of sharing the first cup of the day with someone, the companionable silence of 2 people waking up together. Not together in the way she'd been with Thomas, but together nonetheless. Samuel stirred as they sat at the table, his small face emerging from the blankets like a bird from a nest. He blinked at the unfamiliar surroundings, momentarily confused, then remembered where he was. His eyes found his father first, checking, making sure, then moved to Eleanor. "Morning," Bear said. "Come get warm, son." The boy emerged from his blankets and moved to his father's side, still shy, still uncertain of this strange woman who'd taken them in. Eleanor could see he was the kind of child who'd learned to be quiet, to take up as little space as possible, to not be a burden. It made her heart ache. "Are you hungry?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle. "I can make porridge." Samuel looked at his father, waiting for permission. Bear nodded. "What do you say?" "Yes, please, ma'am," Samuel said softly. "Thank you." Eleanor prepared breakfast, oat porridge with a little dried apple mixed in, another concession to hospitality. She usually ate hers plain, saving the dried fruit for special occasions that never seemed to come. But watching Samuel's face light up at the sweet pieces of apple made her glad she'd used them. They ate together, and Eleanor found herself noticing things. The way Bear made sure his son had enough before taking seconds himself. The way Samuel ate carefully, never spilling, never wasting a single bite. The quiet respect between father and son, built on hardship and mutual dependence. After breakfast, Bear kept his word. He bundled up against the cold and went out to assess the chicken coop. Eleanor followed with Samuel, the boy staying close to her as they fed the chickens and gathered eggs. His hands were small and gentle with the birds, and when one of the hens pecked at him, he didn't jerk away or cry out, just moved his hand more carefully. "You're good with them," Eleanor observed. "Pa says animals know when you're scared or angry. You have to be calm so they stay calm." Samuel glanced up at her. "Is that true?" "It is. Your father's a wise man. He knows lots of things. He can track anything. And he knows which plants are good to eat and which ones make you sick. And he can fight too if he has to, but he says fighting should be the last thing you try, not the first." Eleanor smiled despite herself. "That sounds wise too." They returned to the cabin to find Bear already inside, examining the coffee tin on the shelf. He turned when they entered, and there was something in his expression, embarrassment mixed with determination. "Miss Eleanor," he said, using her name for the first time, "I noticed your coffee's running low. When we head out, I'll leave you some of ours. We have extra in my pack." "That's not necessary. It is to me." Bear's voice was firm but not harsh. "You've been generous with what you have, more generous than you needed to be. I can't repay that fully, but I can do this much." Eleanor wanted to refuse. Wanted to maintain the fiction that she was perfectly fine on her own, that she didn't need anything from anyone. But looking at this man and his son, seeing the pride and gratitude in Bear's eyes and the hope in Samuel's, she found she couldn't. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." Bear nodded, satisfied. Then he hefted the bag he'd been carrying. "I brought this in from my pack. Thought we might all benefit." He opened the bag, and Eleanor saw it was full of dried herbs and tea, carefully wrapped packets of chamomile, mint, something that smelled like sage. Her own supply of such things was nearly depleted, saved only for when she was sick or couldn't sleep. My wife, Bear said, his voice careful when he mentioned her. She was good with plants. Taught me some. I gather what I can, trade some, keep some. Figured you might appreciate it. Eleanor felt something crack in her chest, a small fissure in the wall she'd built around her heart. This man, this stranger, was offering her kindness, not because he expected anything in return, but because that was who he was. Because even in his own grief and hardship, he still saw others and their needs. "I do," she said, her voice rougher than she intended. "I appreciate it very much." The day unfolded slowly. Bear worked on the chicken coop, his hands skilled and sure. Eleanor tended to her indoor chores, mending clothes, organizing supplies, doing the small tasks that filled her days. Samuel helped where he could, fetching things, holding items steady, his presence quiet, but somehow filling the cabin with a warmth Eleanor hadn't felt in years. In the afternoon, when the wind died down enough to make conversation possible, Bear came in from his work, stamping snow from his boots. His cheeks were red with cold, but he was smiling. "Coop's solid now," he reported. "Should hold through whatever winter throws at it." "Thank you." Eleanor poured him coffee, the good coffee, the last of what she'd been hoarding, and watched as he wrapped his cold hands around the cup. Grateful for the warmth, Samuel was at the window watching the snow fall. "It's pretty," he said softly. "Like the whole world is getting a clean blanket." Eleanor moved to stand beside him, looking out at the white landscape. "That's a nice way to think of it. My mama used to say that. She said snow was the world's way of starting fresh, covering up all the old marks and tracks so everything could begin again." There was no sadness in Samuel's voice when he mentioned his mother, just a gentle remembrance. Eleanor glanced at Bear and saw him watching his son with that same protective love, mixed now with a quiet sorrow. "Your mama was right," Eleanor said. "That's exactly what it is." They stood together at the window, three people who'd been strangers less than a day ago, watching the snow fall and the world transform. And Eleanor realized that something was transforming inside her too, something she'd thought was frozen solid and dead. It wasn't much, just a small thaw, a tiny crack in the ice. But it was there, undeniable and growing, and despite all her carefully maintained solitude, despite all her determination to need no one and nothing, Eleanor found she wasn't entirely sorry about it. By evening, the storm had finally begun to ease. The wind no longer howled with quite the same fury, and the snow fell more gently, almost peacefully. But the world outside was buried deep, and Bear, after stepping out to assess the situation, reported that they'd need at least another day before travel would be safe. Eleanor should have felt anxious about the extension, should have felt her carefully guarded space being invaded for longer than she'd planned. Instead, she felt something closer to relief, and that frightened her more than the storm ever could. They ate supper together, venison stew again, with fresh bread Eleanor had baked that afternoon, while Bear worked outside and Samuel watched, asking quiet questions about measurements and rising times. The boy had an eager mind, she'd noticed. He soaked up information like dry earth soaking up rain, curious about everything, but careful not to be a nuisance about it. After the meal, as they cleared the dishes, Bear's attention caught on something Eleanor had almost forgotten was there, the silver-framed photograph that sat on the narrow shelf above her bed, visible now through the open curtain. It showed a younger Eleanor and a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, his arm around her shoulders, both of them squinting slightly into the sun. "Your husband?" Bear asked, his tone respectful, not prying. Eleanor nodded, moving to pick up the frame. She hadn't looked at it properly in months, had learned to see past it the way you learn to see past familiar things. But now, holding it, she really looked at Thomas's face, the face she'd loved for 30 years. "Thomas," she said. "He's been gone 7 years now. Pneumonia took him fast. 3 weeks from healthy to—" She stopped, the words still catching even after all this time. "I'm sorry." Bear's voice carried genuine understanding. "It's a hard thing, losing your partner. Feels like losing half of yourself." "Yes." Eleanor set the photograph back carefully. That's exactly what it feels like. They returned to the main room, and Bear settled near the fire. Samuel was already drowsy, curled up in his blankets, fighting sleep the way children do when they don't want the day to end. Bear reached out and smoothed his son's hair, a gesture so tender it made Eleanor's throat tight. "Tell me about him," she said, surprising herself. "Thomas, I mean." "If you're willing." Bear looked at her, considering, then nodded. "I'd like that. If you'll tell me about Mary after." It was a fair exchange, Eleanor thought. Grief for grief, memory for memory. A way of honoring the ones they'd lost by keeping them alive in words. She told him about meeting Thomas when she was 22, fresh from a teaching position in a small town further east. He'd been a carpenter and builder, skilled with his hands, patient with his work. They'd married within 6 months, scandalously fast by some standards, but they'd both known. Sometimes you just knew. "He built this cabin," she said, gesturing around them. "Every log, every joint, every window frame. He said it was going to be our sanctuary, the place we'd come when the world got too loud. We spent summers here, sometimes fall. It was supposed to be for vacations, for getting away. I never imagined I'd end up living here permanently, but after he died, you needed the sanctuary," Bear said, understanding without her having to explain. "Yes, the town had too many memories, too many people who meant well, but whose sympathy felt like it was suffocating me. I couldn't breathe there anymore." Bear was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Then he began his own story. Mary had been a trapper's daughter, raised in the mountains, comfortable with the hard life. She'd been small and fierce, he said, with a laugh that could light up the darkest winter day. They'd met when he was working as a guide, and she'd been the only woman in a party of eastern hunters who'd hired him to take them into the high country. She could outshoot most men and outthink all of them, Bear said, a smile touching his weathered face. Wasn't intimidated by anything, not the weather, not the animals, not the isolation. When Samuel came along, she took to motherhood the same way, fearless, full of love, determined to raise him right. "What happened?" Eleanor asked gently. "Fever. Same as your Thomas in a way, came on sudden, moved fast. We were at a remote camp, 3 days from any doctor. By the time I got her to Pine Ridge, she was already—" His voice caught. Samuel was 7, old enough to understand what he'd lost, too young to know how to bear it. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, Samuel's soft breathing the only other sound. Outside, the snow continued to fall, gentler now, wrapping them in white. "Do you ever get angry?" Eleanor asked. "At them for leaving? At God for taking them?" Bear considered the question. "I did at first. Spent months angry at everything. Angry at Mary for dying, at myself for not getting her help faster, at the world for being so damn hard. But anger like that, it just eats you up from the inside. Makes you bitter. And I couldn't let Samuel see me like that. He needed his father to be strong, to show him you can survive grief without letting it destroy you. How did you do that? Stay strong for him? Some days I didn't. Some days I wanted to just sit down and never get back up. But then I'd look at him and remember he lost his mother. He was hurting too, maybe worse than me because he was so young. So I had to keep moving, keep working, keep being his father. The grief didn't go away, but it became something I carried instead of something that carried me." Eleanor thought about her own 7 years of isolation, of hiding from the world and her pain. "I didn't have anyone to stay strong for. Maybe that was my problem. Or maybe that was what you needed then," Bear said, not judging, just observing. "Sometimes we need to step back, take time to heal. Nothing wrong with that. But 7 years? However long it takes," Bear met her eyes. "There's no schedule for grief, Miss Eleanor. No right way to do it. You do what you need to survive it." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, the first tears she'd shed in front of another person since Thomas's funeral. "I'm not sure I have survived it. I'm not sure I haven't just been existing, going through motions, waiting. Waiting for what? I don't know. For something to change, maybe. For something to make me feel alive again instead of just—" She gestured helplessly. "Whatever this is." Bear leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "Can I tell you something? And you can tell me to mind my own business if you want." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. I think maybe that's why we ended up at your door tonight. Not just because of the storm, though that was real enough, but because you needed someone to knock. Someone to remind you that there's still life out there, still connection possible. And maybe we needed you too, needed to remember that there are still good people, still kindness in the world. That sounds like you're saying this was meant to be, Eleanor said. Trying for skepticism, but not quite achieving it. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was just luck and a snowstorm. Does it matter? Bear smiled. We're here now. That's what counts. Samuel stirred in his sleep, murmuring something they couldn't make out. Bear adjusted the blankets around him automatically, that same protective gesture Eleanor had seen a dozen times already. You're a good father, she said. I try. Most days I feel like I'm failing him, like I should be giving him more. A real home, schooling, other children to play with. Instead, he's living out of a pack, following me from camp to camp, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. But he has you. He has love and security, and a father who would clearly do anything for him. That's more than a lot of children have. Bear looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. Thank you for saying that. I needed to hear it. They talked late into the night, sharing memories and sorrows, finding comfort in the understanding that can only exist between two people who've walked similar paths through grief. Eleanor told him about the children she'd never had, the future she'd imagined with Thomas that would never be. Bear told her about his fears for Samuel's future, his worry that his son would grow up without the advantages other children had. And slowly, gradually, Eleanor felt something inside her begin to shift. Not the grief that would always be there, she understood that now, but the isolation, the deliberate cutting off from all human connection that was beginning to crack. Like ice on a river when spring finally comes, breaking apart to let the water flow again. When they finally said goodnight, Eleanor lay in her bed and listened to the quiet sounds of Bear settling in his bedroll, of Samuel's peaceful breathing, of two other human hearts beating in the space she'd kept empty for so long. And for the first time in 7 years, Eleanor didn't feel entirely alone. She felt instead something she'd thought was lost to her forever. She felt hope. Morning brought clear skies and a world transformed by snow. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee already brewing and the sound of wood being split outside. For a moment she lay still, disoriented by the sounds of another person moving around her cabin, taking care of things she'd always done herself. When she emerged from her sleeping area, she found Samuel carefully tending the fire, his small face serious with concentration. He looked up when he heard her, and there was worry in his eyes. "I hope it's all right, ma'am," he said quickly. "Pa said I should let you sleep, that you probably don't get much rest with us here. He's outside chopping more wood. He said we used a lot keeping warm, and he wanted to replace what we took." Eleanor felt something warm spread through her chest. "It's more than all right. Thank you, Samuel." The boy's face brightened. "Pa also made the coffee. He said yours yesterday was the best he'd had in months, so he tried to make it the same way." Eleanor poured herself a cup, and it was indeed good, strong and hot, just the way she liked it. She stood at the window, watching Bear work in the cold morning air. He'd already split an impressive pile of wood, his breath making clouds in the frigid air, his movements efficient and practiced. When he came in, his face was red with cold and exertion, but he was smiling. "Morning. Hope we didn't wake you." "You didn't, and you didn't have to do all that. Wanted to." Bear poured himself coffee, wrapping his cold hands around the cup. "The way I figure it, we've imposed on you for 2 nights now. Least I can do is make sure you're not worse off for our presence. You haven't imposed. Eleanor stopped, searching for the right words. "You've been welcome company." It was the closest she could come to admitting what she'd been feeling, that their presence had been less of an intrusion and more of a gift, one she hadn't known she needed until it arrived at her door in the middle of a snowstorm. Bear studied her face, and she saw understanding there. "We've enjoyed it too, more than you probably realize. It's been good for Samuel, being somewhere warm and safe with someone kind. And it's been good for me, having someone to talk to who understands about, he gestured vaguely, encompassing everything they'd shared the night before. I know, Eleanor said softly. It's been good for me too. After breakfast, Bear announced he could probably get them to the line shack at Copper Creek if they started soon. The snow was deep, but packed enough to travel on, and the weather looked stable. Eleanor felt her stomach drop at the pronouncement, and she realized with a start that she didn't want them to go. But Samuel was watching her with those enormous brown eyes, and she forced herself to smile. Well then, I suppose you'd better get your things together. As Bear began organizing their packs, something fell from Samuel's leather satchel, a small wooden figure, carefully carved and smoothed. Eleanor picked it up and found herself holding a horse, beautifully detailed despite its small size, with a flowing mane and proud stance. That's mine, Samuel said, reaching for it quickly but gently. Pa made it for me. It's beautiful. Eleanor handed it back, watching as Samuel clutched it carefully. Your father is very talented. He makes things when we're in camp. Animals mostly, horses, deer, bears, wolves. He says whittling helps him think. Samuel looked up at her shyly. Would you like to see the others? Eleanor nodded, and Samuel opened his satchel fully, carefully removing a small cloth bundle. Inside were more carved figures, a deer with delicate antlers, a wolf mid-howl, a rabbit frozen in alertness, an eagle with outstretched wings. Each was remarkably detailed, clearly the work of skilled hands and patient hours. These are wonderful, Eleanor said, meaning it. You must treasure them. They're all I have from when Mama was alive, Samuel said quietly. Pa made them for me after she died, said they were to remind me that we're part of the wild things, that we belong here in the mountains just like they do. Eleanor's throat tightened. She looked at Bear, who'd stopped packing to watch his son show his treasures. Their eyes met, and she saw in his face a mixture of pride and sorrow, pride in what he'd created for his son, sorrow that wooden figures were among the few things he had to give. Your father's right, Eleanor said. And these will last forever if you take care of them. Better than a lot of things people own. Samuel carefully rewrapped his animals and tucked them back into his satchel. As he did, Eleanor noticed something else, a corner of paper sticking out from an inner pocket. But before she could wonder about it, Bear was speaking. We should head out within the hour if we're going to make decent time, he said. The sun's up, and the snow's not likely to get any more manageable. Eleanor nodded, though everything in her wanted to protest. She busied herself packing food for their journey, bread, dried meat, some of her preserved vegetables wrapped carefully in cloth. Bear tried to refuse, but she insisted with a firmness that surprised them both. You'll need good food for the journey, she said. And I have plenty, please. As they prepared to leave, Samuel came to stand beside her. Thank you for letting us stay, he said formally, the way a child does when he's been taught proper manners. You're very kind. Eleanor knelt down to his level, surprising herself again. You're very welcome, Samuel. You're a good boy. And it's been a pleasure having you here. Then, on impulse, she went to her shelf and took down one of her books, a collection of folk tales with beautiful illustrations, one of her favorites from childhood. I'd like you to have this, she said, offering it to him. For the long winter nights in camp. Samuel's eyes went wide. I can't, that's too much. You can, and it isn't. A boy who appreciates his father's carvings will appreciate these stories too. She pressed it into his hands. Besides, I know them all by heart anyway. Samuel clutched the book like it was made of gold, then threw his arms around Eleanor's waist in a sudden, fierce hug. She stood frozen for a moment, unused to such contact, then slowly, carefully put her arms around him and hugged him back. When he pulled away, there were tears in his eyes. Thank you, he whispered. I'll take very good care of it. I promise. Bear had watched the exchange, with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. Now he stepped forward, extending his hand. Thank you, Eleanor, for everything. You opened your door to strangers in a storm, and you gave us more than just shelter. You reminded us what kindness looks like. Eleanor took his hand, and this time the handshake felt different, not the cautious greeting of strangers, but the warm farewell of friends. "You did the same for me," she said honestly. "You reminded me that there's still life worth living, still people worth knowing." They gathered their things and headed to the door. Eleanor stood on her porch, wrapped in her heavy shawl, watching as they made their way through the deep snow toward the tree line. Samuel kept turning back to wave, and Eleanor waved back each time, something painful and sweet twisting in her chest. Just before they disappeared into the trees, Bear stopped and called back to her. "If we're ever passing this way again, would it be all right if we stopped by?" Eleanor's heart leaped. "I'd like that," she called back. "I'd like that very much." She watched until they were out of sight, swallowed by the white forest and the distance. Then she went back inside her cabin, and for the first time in 7 years, it felt empty in a way that hurt. The silence that had once been her sanctuary now felt oppressive. The space that had been her refuge now seemed too large, too quiet, too lonely. She moved through her daily routine mechanically, but everything felt wrong somehow, off balance. That evening, she sat in her rocking chair, the one Thomas had made, and let herself cry. Not for Thomas this time, though he was part of it, but for herself, for the years she'd wasted hiding from life, for the connection she'd just begun to feel and was already missing desperately. She cried for the child she'd never had, for the family she'd lost, for the loneliness she'd chosen and could now barely stand. And she cried because 2 strangers had walked into her life for 3 days and had somehow, impossibly, changed everything. When the tears finally stopped, Eleanor felt wrung out, but somehow clearer. She understood something now that she hadn't before, that grief doesn't end, but it changes. It becomes something you can carry instead of something that carries you, just as Bear had said. And that opening yourself to new connections, new possibilities, doesn't mean forgetting the ones you've lost. It means honoring them by continuing to live fully, by letting your heart remain open, even when it's been broken. She didn't know if she'd ever see Bear and Samuel again. The mountains were vast, and their lives were transient. But they'd given her something invaluable. They'd shown her that her heart could still feel, still connect, still hope. And that was worth more than all the solitude and safety she'd wrapped around herself for 7 years. That night, as she lay in bed, Eleanor made a decision. When spring came, she wouldn't hide anymore. She'd go to Pine Ridge more often, maybe even accept some of those social invitations she'd been declining for years. She'd start living again, really living instead of just surviving. It was what Thomas would have wanted. It was what Bear and Samuel had shown her was possible, and it was. She realized what she wanted too. The cabin was quiet, but the quiet felt different now. Not the dead silence of isolation, but the peaceful silence of someone who knows that connection is possible, that life continues, that hope still exists in the world. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle and soft, covering the tracks that led away from her door. But Eleanor knew that some marks couldn't be covered, some changes couldn't be undone. 3 days had changed her, and she would never be quite the same again. 3 weeks passed. The world settled into the deep freeze of mountain winter, and Eleanor fell back into her routines. But everything felt different now. The silence that had once been comforting now echoed with absence. The solitary meals reminded her of shared breakfasts. The empty evenings by the fire made her remember Bear's stories and Samuel's quiet questions. She found herself talking aloud more than she had in years. Not to herself exactly, but as if Bear and Samuel might still be there to hear her. "The chickens are laying well today," she'd say to the empty cabin. Samuel would have enjoyed gathering these eggs. Or, "The wood's burning clean tonight." Bear stacked it just right. She realized, lonely. Not the numb isolation she'd chosen for 7 years, but an acute awareness of solitude that came from knowing what companionship felt like and missing it desperately. Then, on a bright afternoon in early December, she heard it again, that sound that didn't belong. Not a knock this time, but voices calling from a distance, one deep and one high and young. Eleanor's heart leaped. She rushed to the door and flung it open to see two familiar figures making their way through the snow toward her cabin. Bear, with his distinctive broad-shouldered gait, and Samuel beside him waving enthusiastically. "We hope we're not intruding," Bear called as they got closer. "But we were passing through and Samuel insisted we stop by." "Pa said we couldn't impose," Samuel added. "But I wanted to see if you were all right." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but these were different tears. Tears of joy, of relief, of something she couldn't quite name. "You're not intruding at all. Come in, please." "Come in." They entered, bringing cold air and snowflakes and an immediate warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Samuel rushed to show her that he still had the book, that he'd been reading it every night, that he'd already finished it twice. Bear stood back, watching with that gentle smile, his eyes meeting Eleanor's with an understanding that needed no words. "We're on our way back from the trapping camp," Bear explained, as Eleanor bustled about making coffee and setting out food. "Made good money this season, enough to see us through spring. We've got a few days before we need to head to our next camp, and I thought—" He paused, seeming uncertain for the first time since she'd known him. "I thought maybe we could stay a day or two, if you're willing. Help out with whatever needs doing. Just spend some time." "Yes," Eleanor said immediately. "Yes, please stay. I'd like that very much." And just like that, her cabin was full again, full of voices and laughter and the small domestic sounds of people living together. Samuel helped her with the animals, chattering about everything he'd seen at the trapping camp. The lynx tracks, the way ice formed on the river, the northern lights he'd seen one clear night. Bear set about repairing things. A loose board on the porch, a sticky window. Small tasks Eleanor had been putting off because they seemed too much trouble for just herself. That evening, as they sat down to supper, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in years: contentment. Not happiness exactly, which seemed too simple a word, but a deep sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly the people she was meant to be with. After the meal, as Samuel dozed by the fire with his book still clutched in his hands, Bear's attention was drawn to something Eleanor had forgotten about: the old fiddle hanging on the wall. It was Thomas's instrument, one she hadn't touched since he died, couldn't bear to touch because it would make his absence too real. "May I?" Bear asked, gesturing to it. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "Do you play?" "Some. Not as well as I'd like, but enough to make music." He took down the fiddle carefully, reverently, as if he understood what it meant to her. "My father played. Taught me when I was younger than Samuel. Haven't had much chance to practice in recent years, but—" He drew the bow across the strings, wincing slightly at the sound. "Needs tuning." He spent a few minutes adjusting it, his hands sure on the pegs, his ear attuned to the pitch. Then he began to play. Simple folk songs at first, mountain melodies that had probably been old when this country was young. The sound filled the cabin, warm and alive, and Eleanor felt something break open inside her. She'd thought she could never hear music in this space again without Thomas. But here was Bear playing Thomas's fiddle, and instead of pain she felt connection, a sense that life continued, that joy could exist again, that one person's absence didn't have to mean the end of all beauty and warmth. Samuel woke to the music and sat up, his face glowing. "Pa, play the one Mama liked." Bear's fingers hesitated on the strings, then he nodded. The melody that followed was slower, sweeter, tinged with melancholy but beautiful nonetheless. Eleanor watched as he played, saw the memories moving behind his eyes, the love and loss intertwined in every note. When the song ended, there was silence for a moment. Then Samuel spoke softly. "Mama used to dance to that one. Even when she was tired or sick, if Pa played it, she'd get up and dance. She sounds like she was a wonderful woman," Eleanor said. She was. Bear set the fiddle down carefully. She had this way of finding joy in everything, even when times were hard. Even when we had nothing, she'd say we had each other, and that was enough. I try to remember that, try to teach Samuel that the important things aren't the things you can buy or own. They're the moments you share, the people you love. Eleanor felt tears on her cheeks and didn't bother to wipe them away. Thomas was like that too. He could make me laugh even on the hardest days. He'd say the richest people he knew were the ones who had someone to share their life with, someone who made the good times better and the bad times bearable. They would have liked each other, I think, Bear said. Mary and Thomas. I think so too. They sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling, the warmth surrounding them like an embrace. Samuel had fallen asleep again, lulled by the music and the sense of safety. Eleanor looked at him, then at Bear, and felt something shift in her understanding. This was what Thomas had wanted for her, not endless grief, not isolation, but this, connection, community, the courage to open her heart again, even knowing it could be hurt again, the willingness to let people in, to share her life, to find family in unexpected places. I've been thinking, Bear said after a while, his voice low so as not to wake Samuel, about what you said when we left, that we reminded you life was worth living. You did the same for us, Eleanor. For 3 days, Samuel had a home, a real home with warmth and kindness, and someone besides me to care about him. And I got to remember what it feels like to have, he struggled for words, to have a place to belong, I guess. Not just a camp or a temporary shelter, but a place where someone's glad to see you come through the door. You always have that here, Eleanor said, the words coming easily, naturally. Both of you. Whenever you're passing through, whenever you need a place to rest, this door is open to you, always. Bear met her eyes and she saw gratitude there. And something else, a cautious hope maybe, or the beginning of an idea neither of them was quite ready to name yet. Thank you, he said simply. That means more than you know. They talked late into the night again, and this time the conversation was easier, more natural. They'd moved past being strangers, or even friendly acquaintances. They were becoming something else, friends certainly, but maybe something more. Not romantic love. Neither of them was looking for that, still too tied to the partners they'd lost. But something deeper than simple friendship. A chosen family, perhaps. A deliberate connection between people who understood each other's grief and were helping each other heal. When Eleanor finally lay down to sleep that night, with Bear and Samuel settled comfortably in the main room, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Her cabin wasn't empty anymore, not really. Even when they left again, and she knew they would, knew their life was one of movement and season, something of them would remain. They'd filled her space with warmth and laughter and belonging, and those things didn't simply disappear when people left. They lingered. They changed you. They reminded you that you were still alive, still capable of connection, still able to open your heart, even after it had been broken. And that, Eleanor thought, as sleep finally claimed her, was worth more than all the safety and solitude in the world. They'd planned to stay 2 days, but those 2 days stretched into 4, then 5. The weather held clear and cold, perfect for travel, but none of them seemed in a hurry to end what they'd found together. Bear kept finding small repairs to make, small ways to contribute. Samuel helped Eleanor with everything. The animals, the cooking, the daily tasks, his presence like sunshine in the cabin. And Eleanor found herself making excuses to delay their departure, suggesting projects that needed Bear's skills, finding reasons why tomorrow would be a better day to leave than today. On the morning of what would have been their 6th day, Eleanor was helping Samuel pack his things, making sure the book was wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect it from the elements. As she lifted his leather satchel to hand it to him, the strap, already worn and repaired multiple times, finally gave way. The bag tumbled to the floor, and its contents spilled across the boards. Samuel made a small sound of distress and dropped to his knees, quickly gathering his precious carved animals. Eleanor knelt to help, and that's when she saw them, the letters. 3 of them, official-looking with careful handwriting, poking out from where they'd been carefully folded and tucked into an inner pocket of the satchel. She shouldn't have looked. It was none of her business. But the top letter had come unfolded, and she couldn't help but see the salutation to James McCain regarding the boy Samuel. Her heart stuttered. She tried to look away, tried to respect their privacy, but her eyes caught words. Your late wife's family, boy's welfare, more suitable arrangement. And then, most damning, The circumstances of Mary's death, your negligence, proper upbringing. Eleanor's hands froze on the letter. Samuel was still gathering his animals, unaware of what she'd seen. Before she could stop herself, before she could think about whether it was right or wrong, Eleanor's eyes scanned more of the page. The letter was from a law office in Pine Ridge, but it was clear it had been written on behalf of Mary's family, the Thorntons. Apparently a name Eleanor vaguely recognized from her rare visits to town. They were merchants, reasonably prosperous by frontier standards, respected in the community. The letter was dated 2 months ago, and it made Eleanor's blood run cold. They were agreeing to see Samuel. After years of refusing to acknowledge him, of calling him the trapper's bastard, a phrase that made Eleanor's hands clench, they were finally willing to meet him. But the conditions were harsh. They would consider taking him in, providing him with education and proper society, but only if Bear agreed to certain terms. The boy would live with them. He would take the Thornton name, and Bear would have limited contact, visits only at the family's discretion, and only if the boy was adjusting well. Most crushing of all was a line near the end. We feel it necessary to note that Mary's death, while attributed to fever, occurred during a period of extreme poverty and hardship. Had she remained with her family, rather than marrying against our wishes, she would likely still be alive. The boy deserves better than a life of transience and want. Eleanor's vision blurred with anger. How dare they? How dare they blame Bear for Mary's death, for the simple fact that illness could strike anyone, anywhere? How dare they suggest that a child would be better off without his loving father, in the care of people who'd rejected him for 7 years? She looked up to find Bear standing in the doorway, his face ashen. He'd been outside splitting wood, must have come in and seen her reading the letter. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Samuel, oblivious, was carefully rewrapping his animals. Eleanor, Bear started, his voice rough. How long have you been carrying this? She asked, keeping her voice low so Samuel wouldn't hear. The letters arrived at the trading post in Pine Ridge 2 months ago. I picked them up on our way through, and you're considering it. She couldn't keep the hurt from her voice, the sense of betrayal. You're thinking about giving him up? Bear's face crumpled, years of anguish showing through the cracks in his composure. Every single day I wonder if I'm being selfish. Every single day I look at him and think about what I can't give him. A real home, an education, other children to play with, security. Everything those letters say is true, Eleanor. Mary did die because we were poor, because I couldn't get her to a doctor fast enough, because we were 3 days from help in a remote camp. That's not your fault, isn't it? Bear's voice broke. I chose that life. She came with me because she loved me, but maybe she shouldn't have. Maybe if she'd stayed with her family, lived in town, had access to proper medical care, maybe she'd have died anyway, Eleanor said firmly. Fever takes people in town too, Bear. You know that. I lost Thomas in Pine Ridge, with a doctor right there. Sometimes people die, and it's nobody's fault. It's just life. Hard, unfair, terrible life. Samuel looked up, sensing the tension. Pa? Miss Eleanor? Is something wrong? Bear wiped his eyes quickly, forced a smile. Nothing, son. Just talking about our plans. But Samuel wasn't fooled. His eyes went to the letter in Eleanor's hand, then to his father's face, and something in his expression shuddered. He'd learned to read adult emotions, Eleanor realized. Had probably spent 2 years watching his father carry this burden, feeling his own guilt for being the cause of it. It's about Mama's family, isn't it? Samuel said quietly. The Thorntons. Bear closed his eyes. You know about them? I heard you talking to Mr. Henderson at the trading post, about how they wanted to meet me. Samuel's voice was very small, very controlled. About how they might take me in. Eleanor's heart shattered. This child, this beautiful, gentle child, had been carrying this knowledge, this worry, probably for months, wondering if his father would send him away, trying to be good enough, useful enough to make him want to keep him. Samuel! Bear knelt down, taking his son's shoulders. I would never send you away, never. You're my son. And I love you more than anything in this world. But they could give me things you can't, Samuel said. And he was crying now, quiet tears streaming down his face. A real house, school, nice clothes. I heard what the letter said, Pa. I heard it when you read it out loud to yourself. They said Mama died because we were poor. That's not true, Eleanor said fiercely. She moved to kneel beside them both, putting her hand on Samuel's small shoulder. Your mama died because sometimes people get sick and medicine can't save them. It has nothing to do with being poor or rich. And those people who say otherwise, they don't know what they're talking about. But maybe I should go, Samuel said, his voice breaking. Maybe Pa would have an easier life without me. Maybe— Stop, Bear said, pulling his son into his arms. Stop right now. You are not a burden. You are not making my life harder. You are the only reason I get up every morning, the only reason any of this matters. Do you understand me? Samuel nodded against his father's chest, but Eleanor could see he didn't quite believe it. How could he? He was 9 years old, had lost his mother, and had probably heard or sensed his father's doubts about whether he could provide enough. Eleanor made a decision in that moment, a decision that would change all their lives, though she didn't fully understand the implications yet. She just knew that these two people, this man and this boy, had become too important to her to let them be torn apart by guilt and misplaced obligation. I have a proposal, she said. They both looked at her, Bear's eyes red-rimmed, Samuel's face still streaked with tears. Before you make any decisions about Samuel's future, before you even consider what those letters are suggesting, I want you to hear me out. Eleanor, please, just listen. She took a breath, hardly believing what she was about to suggest. Stay here, both of you, for the winter, maybe longer. You said you made good money trapping this season. Stay here. Let Samuel see what it's like to have a stable home for a few months. Let him, her voice caught, let him have a proper winter with regular meals and warmth and someone besides his father to care about him. And let yourself see if maybe, just maybe, there's another option besides constantly moving or giving him up to people who rejected him for 7 years. Bear stared at her. We can't ask that of you. You're not asking. I'm offering. Eleanor looked at Samuel, at his hopeful face, and felt her resolve strengthen. I have space. I have enough supplies for 3 if we're careful. And I have— She paused, surprised by the truth of what she was about to say. I have a need to not be alone anymore. You gave me that gift, Bear, you both did. You showed me I was still alive, still capable of connection. Let me return that gift. Let me give Samuel a home for the winter. Let me give you both a place to belong, even if it's just temporary. I'm not asking you to give up your life or your work. Come spring, when the thaw comes, you can decide what's next. Maybe you'll go back to trapping full-time. Maybe you'll take the Thorntons up on their offer, though I hope to God you won't. Maybe you'll find some other path entirely. But at least Samuel will have had one winter where he didn't have to worry about the next camp, the next move, whether there'd be enough food or enough warmth. Samuel was looking at his father with such naked hope it hurt to see. Bear looked between his son and Eleanor, and she saw him warring with himself, pride against practicality, independence against his child's needs. And in return, he finally asked, Because I won't take charity, Eleanor. I can't. In return, you help me prepare this place for a longer occupancy. We'll need to build another sleeping space, maybe a small addition. You'll help with the heavy work, the hunting, the wood cutting. And you'll teach Samuel everything you know about the mountains, about survival, about being a good man. And I'll teach him reading and writing and arithmetic. We'll do this together as— She searched for the word— as partners, as family. The word hung in the air between them, fragile and powerful. Family, Bear repeated softly, as if testing how it felt in his mouth. Family, Samuel whispered. And it sounded like a prayer. Eleanor nodded, her own eyes filling with tears now. If you'll have me, if you'll let an old widow woman be part of your family, I'd consider it an honor. Bear reached out and took her hand, and his grip was strong and warm and grateful. The honor would be ours. And just like that, everything changed. 3 broken people, 3 souls who'd lost what they thought they couldn't live without, found each other in a cabin in the mountains and decided to build something new, not a replacement for what they'd lost. That would never be possible, but something different, something chosen, something that might, with time and care and love, become exactly what they all needed to heal. Outside, the snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin, warmth bloomed like spring flowers in winter ground. Hope, fragile and precious, took root in soil that had been frozen for far too long, and 3 hearts, scarred by loss but still beating, still reaching for connection, began to remember what it felt like to belong. The decision made, they threw themselves into the work of transforming Eleanor's solitary cabin into a home for 3. Bear and Eleanor spent long hours planning the addition, a small sleeping room that would connect to the main cabin through a covered walkway, giving them all privacy while keeping them close. It would be modest, just large enough for 2 beds and a small stove, but it would be theirs. They began work immediately, even though winter made construction difficult. Bear had experience building in harsh conditions, and Eleanor's knowledge of her own land proved invaluable. They selected trees carefully, felled them in the crisp winter air, their breath making clouds as they worked. Samuel helped where he could, dragging branches, sorting lumber, his face glowing with purpose and belonging. The first week was the hardest. Not the physical labor, though that was demanding enough, but the adjustment of 3 people learning to live together, to navigate each other's habits and needs and boundaries. Eleanor had lived alone for 7 years and had to relearn how to share her space. Bear was used to temporary camps and constant movement, not the settled rhythms of a permanent home. And Samuel, despite his joy at staying, carried the weight of those letters. The knowledge that somewhere out there, people were waiting to judge whether his father was fit to raise him, but they persevered. Eleanor established a routine, morning lessons for Samuel at the kitchen table, while Bear worked on the addition. She'd found her old teaching materials in a trunk, primers and slates and books she'd once used in her brief career as a schoolteacher before marrying Thomas. Samuel soaked up knowledge like dry earth soaking up rain, his bright mind hungry for learning. "He's remarkably quick," Eleanor told Bear one evening after Samuel had gone to sleep. "He's reading at a level far beyond his years and his mathematics. He grasps concepts I wouldn't have expected from a child with no formal schooling." Bear's face showed pride and pain in equal measure. Mary taught him his letters before she died. She'd wanted him to have education, opportunities. It's part of why he stopped, but Eleanor understood. Part of why he was tormented by the question of whether Samuel would be better off with the Thorntons. "He's getting education here," Eleanor said firmly. "And more importantly, he's getting love and security and the knowledge that he's wanted. That matters more than any fancy school." As December deepened, the addition took shape. It was slow work in the cold, and there were setbacks. Days when the weather was too fierce to work outside, days when materials proved unsuitable and had to be replaced. But gradually walls rose. A roof took shape. Windows were fitted. Bear's skill with his hands was evident in every carefully joined corner, every smoothly planned board. Samuel watched his father work with open admiration, and Bear began teaching him how to measure twice and cut once, how to read wood grain, how to fit joints so they'd hold for decades. The boy's small hands learned to hold tools properly, to drive nails straight, to sand wood smooth. Eleanor watched them work together and saw not just a father teaching his son, but a legacy being passed down, skills and knowledge that would serve Samuel all his life, regardless of where that life led him. In the evenings, after work was done and supper finished, they fell into patterns that felt like they'd existed forever rather than just weeks. Bear would whittle while Eleanor mended or prepared lessons. Samuel would read aloud from his books, practicing, and they'd all listen to the stories that had once comforted Eleanor in her loneliness and now bound them together. Sometimes Bear would take down the fiddle and play, and the cabin would fill with music. Eleanor found herself humming along, even singing sometimes, her voice rusty from years of disuse, but growing stronger. Samuel would dance, unself-conscious and joyful, and watching him, Eleanor and Bear would exchange glances that spoke of shared wonder at this child's resilience, his capacity for happiness despite everything he'd endured. But beneath the domestic peace, Eleanor could see Bear's ongoing struggle. He'd wake sometimes in the night, and she'd hear him moving restlessly in the main room. Once she found him standing at the window at dawn, staring out at the mountains, his face etched with worry. "You're thinking about the letters," she said quietly, not wanting to wake Samuel. Bear nodded. "I keep wondering if I'm being selfish, if I'm keeping him here because it's what I want, not what's best for him. What does Samuel want? He's 9 years old. How can he know what's best for his future?" "Maybe he can't know about his future," Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully. "But he knows about his present. He knows he's happy here. He knows he feels safe and loved. Isn't that worth something?" "Of course it is. But what about next year? The year after? What happens when he's 12, 14, 16? When other boys his age are in school, learning trades, preparing for their futures? What can I offer him then?" Eleanor had been thinking about this too, had been forming an idea she wasn't quite sure how to voice. Now with Bear's doubt laid bare, she decided to take the risk. What if you didn't have to offer it alone? She said, what if this wasn't just for one winter? What if we made this permanent? Bear turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the pre-dawn light. "Eleanor, hear me out. You could trap seasonally the way you planned. Short trips, a few weeks at a time, not the long months away. Samuel could stay here with me, continue his education. You'd have a home base, a real home to come back to. And Samuel would have stability, schooling, and both of us looking after him. That's asking too much of you, is it? Or is it exactly what I need too?" Elena moved closer, her voice earnest. "I was dead inside, Bear, buried alongside Thomas, just going through motions. You and Samuel brought me back to life, gave me purpose again, gave me a reason to care about tomorrow. That's not a burden, that's a gift." Bear was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "The Thorntons will expect an answer eventually. They'll want to meet Samuel, see if he struggled with the words, "if he's worth their attention." "Then let them meet him," Eleanor said, surprising herself with her vehemence. "Let them see what a remarkable boy he is, and let them see that he already has a family that chose him, that wants him, that loves him exactly as he is. They might not accept that. They might push harder, especially if they see he's doing well. They could claim I'm denying him opportunities. Then we'll deal with it, together." Eleanor put her hand on his arm. "You don't have to face this alone anymore, Bear. That's what family means. We face things together." The sun was rising now, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. Bear looked out at the mountains, then back at Eleanor, and she saw something shift in his face, a letting go of some burden he'd carried alone for too long. "All right," he said quietly. "We'll try it your way. We'll build something here together. And when the Thorntons call, because they will, we'll face them as a family." Eleanor felt relief flood through her, followed quickly by determination. They would make this work. They had to. Christmas approached, and Eleanor found herself planning for it with an enthusiasm she hadn't felt since Thomas's death. She wanted to make it special for Samuel, wanted to give him memories of a real holiday in a real home. She and Bear made secret trips to Pine Ridge, trading for small luxuries, ribbon, peppermints, a slate and chalk for Samuel's lessons, fabric for new shirts. In town, Eleanor noticed the stares, the whispers. A widow woman living with a mountain man and his son. People had opinions about that. She could see it in their eyes. But she held her head high, made her purchases, and ignored the gossip. What did it matter what people thought? She knew the truth of what they were building, and that was enough. At the trading post, Mr. Henderson pulled her aside. "Eleanor, folks are talking about you and that McCain fellow. Just want to make sure that everything's proper. Everything is exactly as it should be," Eleanor said firmly. "Bear and Samuel are staying with me for the winter. He's helping with repairs and heavy work, and I'm teaching the boy his letters. It's a practical arrangement that benefits all of us. And the Thorntons? I hear they've been asking about the boy." Eleanor's spine stiffened. "What about them?" "They've been making inquiries, asking whether McCain's fit to raise a child, whether the boy's being properly cared for. Some folks told them about your arrangement and, well, they're not pleased." Martha Thornton came into town last week, asking questions, making noise about what's proper and what isn't. Eleanor felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The boy is well cared for. He's safe, healthy, happy and learning. That's all that should matter. I agree. But the Thorntons are influential people, Eleanor. They could make trouble if they wanted to. Let them try, Eleanor said, but her confidence was shaken. She finished her shopping quickly and headed back to the cabin, her mind churning with worry. She didn't tell Bear about the conversation at first. Christmas was coming, and she didn't want to ruin it with fears about what might happen. But the knowledge sat heavy in her chest. The Thorntons were watching, judging, preparing to make their move. The addition was finished 2 days before Christmas, and they celebrated by having Samuel choose which bed would be his. He picked the one by the window, saying he wanted to wake up to the mountain view. That night, he slept in his own bed in a room that was partially his, and Eleanor heard Bear moving around long after dark, unable to settle, perhaps mourning the end of having his son sleep beside him, perhaps simply adjusting to this new phase of their life. Christmas Eve arrived clear and cold. They decorated simply, pine boughs and red ribbons, candles in the windows. Eleanor had saved back some of her best preserves, and they made a feast by frontier standards: venison roast, potatoes, carrots, fresh bread, and a dried apple pie that filled the cabin with the scent of cinnamon. After supper, they exchanged gifts. Samuel gave Eleanor a drawing he'd made. All three of them standing in front of the cabin, smoke curling from the chimney, mountains rising behind them. In the corner, he'd carefully lettered, "Our family." Eleanor had to turn away to hide her tears. Bear gave Eleanor a carved box he'd made from scraps of the addition's lumber. Inside, nestled in cloth, was a carefully carved bird, a mountain bluebird, symbol of happiness, he said. Eleanor gave Bear a new shirt she'd sewn in secret and a warm scarf. For Samuel, she'd prepared a complete set of school supplies and a new book, Robinson Crusoe, for a boy who understood what it meant to survive in harsh conditions. But the real gift, the one that made Samuel's face light up like the sun, was from his father. Bear had been working on it in secret, during odd moments when Samuel was occupied with lessons. It was a complete set of buildings, a carved cabin, a barn, a chicken coop, and tiny figures of people and animals. An entire homestead, perfect in miniature, every detail carefully rendered. "So you can remember this," Bear said softly, as Samuel examined each piece with wonder. "So no matter where life takes you, you'll always have this winter, this home, this family." Samuel threw his arms around his father, then around Eleanor, and the three of them stood there in a tight embrace, bound by love and choice and the determination to protect what they'd built. Later, after Samuel had reluctantly gone to bed, clutching his carved homestead, Eleanor and Bear sat by the fire. She told him then about what Mr. Henderson had said, about the Thorntons making inquiries. Bear's jaw tightened. "I knew this was coming. I just hoped," he shook his head, "hoped we'd have more time before we had to face it. What do you think they'll do? They'll want to meet him, assess whether I'm providing adequate care, and when they see that he's happy and healthy and learning, they'll probably offer to take him anyway, claiming they can provide more. Better education, better opportunities, a proper home." The bitterness in his voice was clear. "And if you refuse, they could take it to the territorial judge. Claim I'm unfit, that I'm denying Samuel opportunities. They have money, influence, respectability. I'm just a trapper who couldn't save his wife." The old guilt was back in his voice, the old doubt. "You're his father," Eleanor said fiercely, "and you're a good man who loves his son. That has to count for something, does it? In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of people with power and money." Bear looked at her, and his eyes were full of fear. "What if they're right, Eleanor? What if I'm being selfish keeping him when they could give him so much more?" Eleanor took his hands, held them tight. "Listen to me. Samuel doesn't need more things. He needs you. He needs to know he's loved, that he belongs, that he matters. Everything else, the education, the opportunities, those can come from anywhere. But a father's love, that can only come from you. But what if it's not enough?" "It is enough. It has to be." Eleanor's voice broke. Because the alternative, sending him to people who rejected him for 7 years, who blamed you for his mother's death, who see him as a charity case to be reformed, that would break him. And it would break you. And Bear, I can't watch that happen, not now. Not after we've all found each other. Bear pulled her into an embrace, and Eleanor realized it was the first time they'd held each other. Not romantic, but the desperate clinging of two people facing a storm together, drawing strength from each other's presence. Whatever happens, Bear said into her hair, thank you for giving us this, for giving Samuel a real Christmas, a real home, even if it's just for a little while. Thank you for making us family. We are family, Eleanor whispered back. And family fights for each other. Whatever the Thorntons try, we'll face it together. All three of us. They stood there for a long time, holding each other, drawing courage from their shared determination. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the world in white. Inside, the fire burned warm, and a child slept peacefully in his own bed, dreaming of the family he'd found and the home he'd been given. But in Pine Ridge, 30 miles away, Martha Thornton sat at her desk, writing a letter to the territorial judge. A letter about a young boy being raised in improper conditions by an unfit father and an unmarried woman. A letter that would arrive in 3 weeks and change everything. The storm was coming. But this time they would face it together. And that, Eleanor thought, as she finally released Bear and they each retreated to their separate spaces, made all the difference. They had something to fight for now. Someone to fight for. And they would fight with everything they had to keep their family together, because some things, once found, are too precious to let go without a battle. And love, real love, chosen love, family love, that was worth fighting for with every breath, every heartbeat, every ounce of courage they could muster. The question wasn't whether they would fight. The question was whether their fight would be enough. January arrived with brutal cold and clear skies. The world was frozen solid, and life in the cabin settled into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. Morning lessons, afternoon work, evening stories and music. Samuel was thriving, his reading improving daily, his understanding of mathematics growing. Bear made short trapping runs, never more than 3 days away, always returning to find Eleanor and Samuel waiting, the cabin warm and welcoming. They were happy. That was the simple truth of it. 3 people who'd been broken by loss had found a way to heal together, to build something new from the pieces of their shattered lives. Eleanor caught herself humming while she worked, caught herself looking forward to tomorrow in a way she hadn't in 7 years. Bear's face had lost some of its weathered worry, and he smiled more easily, laughed more freely. And Samuel bloomed like a flower finally given sun and water, his natural brightness no longer dampened by uncertainty and fear. But happiness, Eleanor had learned, was a fragile thing. On a morning in mid-January, a rider arrived. Not just any rider, but the territorial marshal, accompanied by a clerk from the county office. Eleanor saw them coming from the window and felt her stomach drop. Bear was outside splitting wood, and he stopped when he heard the horses, his face going still and careful. The marshal was a lean man with grey hair and tired eyes, someone who'd seen too much of human nature and wasn't impressed by most of it. He dismounted and nodded respectfully to Bear, then to Eleanor as she came out onto the porch. "Mr. McCain, Miss Hartwell, I'm Marshal Dawson. This is Mr. Pierce from the county clerk's office. We're here on official business regarding the boy, Samuel McCain." Eleanor felt Bear tense beside her, saw his hands clench. She reached out and touched his arm, a silent reminder, together. What business would that be? Bear asked, his voice carefully controlled. Marshal Dawson pulled out a folded document. "We have a petition here from the Thornton family requesting a formal assessment of the boy's living conditions and care. They've expressed concerns about his welfare and have requested that the territorial court consider their petition to assume guardianship." The words hit like physical blows. Eleanor saw the color drain from Bear's face, saw years of fear and doubt crystallize into this moment. "My son is well cared for," Bear said. and his voice was steady, despite the fear Eleanor could see in his eyes. He's healthy, safe, and receiving education. There's no cause for concern. That's what we're here to assess, Mr. Pierce said, pulling out a notebook. He was younger than the marshal, officious and self-important. We need to inspect the living conditions, speak with the boy, and make a report to the judge. May we see the boy? Marshal Dawson asked, and his tone was more gentle than the clerk's, suggesting he wasn't entirely comfortable with his mission. Samuel had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of strange voices. He looked small standing there, his eyes wide, moving between his father and the strangers with growing fear. "Pa," he said softly. "What's happening?" Bear moved to his son, put a protective hand on his shoulder. "These men are here to ask some questions. It's all right." But it wasn't all right, and they all knew it. Mr. Pierce spent the next hour examining everything: the cabin, the addition, the supplies, the schoolwork Eleanor had saved. He asked Samuel questions about his daily routine, his meals, his lessons. The boy answered carefully, his voice small and frightened, clearly understanding that something important was at stake, even if he didn't fully grasp what. Eleanor watched it all with growing anger. How dare these strangers come into their home, question their family, judge their lives? How dare the Thorntons, who'd rejected this child for 7 years, suddenly decide they knew what was best for him? Finally, Mr. Pierce closed his notebook. "The living conditions appear adequate," he said, making it sound like grudging admission. "The boy seems healthy and is receiving basic education. However, the petition raises valid concerns about long-term stability and proper social development. The Thornton family can provide a permanent home, formal schooling, and social opportunities that clearly aren't available here." "He has a permanent home," Eleanor said, unable to stay quiet any longer. "He has people who love him and want him. That matters more than any social opportunity. With respect, Miss Hartwell, the law considers many factors when determining a child's best interests. Emotional attachment is one factor, but practical considerations..." "Practical considerations?" Eleanor's voice rose. "You mean money and social standing? You mean that because the Thorntons have a big house in town and Bear lives in the mountains, they're automatically more fit to raise his own child?" Marshal Dawson held up a hand. "Nobody's making any decisions today. We're just gathering information for the judge. There'll be a hearing in 2 weeks in Pine Ridge. Both parties will have the chance to present their case, and the judge will decide what's in the boy's best interests." Bear's voice was hollow. "And if the judge decides in favor of the Thorntons?" The marshal's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Then Samuel will be placed in their custody, and visitation rights will be determined by the court." Eleanor felt the world tilt. This couldn't be happening. They couldn't lose Samuel. Not after everything they'd built. Not after finally becoming a family. But as she watched the marshal and clerk ride away, their official document tucked safely in a saddlebag, she knew the fight they'd been preparing for had finally arrived, and she had no idea if they were strong enough to win it. The 2 weeks before the hearing passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Bear contacted a lawyer in Pine Ridge, a man named Samuel Harris, who took cases for minimal fees and had a reputation for fairness, if not brilliance. Eleanor organized all of Samuel's schoolwork, documented his progress, prepared testimony about his daily routine and development. But beneath all the practical preparations, fear gnawed at them. Samuel grew quiet and withdrawn, the light that had been growing in him dimming day by day. He stopped playing with his carved animals, stopped dancing to his father's fiddle music. He went through his lessons mechanically, and at night Eleanor could hear him crying softly in his room. One evening, a week before the hearing, Samuel came to where Eleanor was preparing supper. His face was pale and determined, and he was carrying something in his hands, the drawing he'd made at Christmas, the one showing their family together. "Miss Eleanor," he said, his voice trembling but resolute, "I need to tell you something." Eleanor knelt down to his level. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I've been thinking about the hearing, about what might happen, and his voice broke. "I think maybe I should go with the Thorntons." Eleanor felt her heart stop. Samuel, no, let me finish, please. He took a shaky breath. I love you and Pa more than anything. This has been the best time of my whole life, living here, being a family. But what if the judge says Pa's not fit? What if they take me away and say Pa can't even visit me? At least if I go with the Thorntons willingly, maybe they'll let Pa see me sometimes. Maybe Eleanor pulled him into her arms, feeling him shake with suppressed sobs. Oh, Samuel, sweet, brave boy. You should never have to make a choice like that. You should never have to sacrifice your happiness to protect your father. But I can't lose him, Samuel whispered into her shoulder. I can't. He's all I have left of Mama. He's my Pa. Bear had come in and heard the end of the conversation. He moved to them both, wrapping them in his strong arms, and Eleanor felt him shaking too, overcome with emotion he'd been holding back for 2 weeks. You're not going to lose me, Bear said fiercely. And you're not going to sacrifice yourself. I won't allow it. Whatever happens at that hearing, we're going to tell the truth, that we're a family, that we belong together, that no amount of money or social standing can replace what we have here. But Pa, no buts. Samuel, look at me. Bear cupped his son's face in his work-roughened hands. Your mother taught me something before she died. She said that the only thing that really matters in this life is love. Not money, not status, not what other people think. Just love, and we have that here, the 3 of us. We have more love in this cabin than most people find in a lifetime. Then why might they take me away? It was Eleanor who answered. Because sometimes people confuse what's comfortable with what's right. Because they think a big house and fancy clothes matter more than a father's love. But they're wrong, Samuel, and we're going to make that judge see they're wrong. Samuel looked between them, and slowly some of the fear in his face eased. You really think we can win? I think we can fight, Eleanor said. And that's all we can control. We can tell our truth and trust that justice will prevail. The night before the hearing, none of them slept well. Eleanor lay awake, listening to the sounds of the cabin, Bear's restless movements in the addition, Samuel's fitful sleep, the wind outside carrying whispers of change. She thought about Thomas, about what he would say if he could see her now. Would he approve of what she'd done, taking in a mountain man and his son, letting them become her family? She thought he would. Thomas had always believed in following your heart, in choosing love over fear. Morning came grey and cold. They dressed in their best clothes, Bear in the shirt Eleanor had made him, Samuel in a new outfit Eleanor had sewn, Eleanor herself in a dress she hadn't worn since Thomas's funeral. They looked like a family, Eleanor thought. They looked like they belonged together. The ride to Pine Ridge was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts and fears. As the town came into view, Eleanor reached across the wagon seat and took Bear's hand. He squeezed back, grateful for the contact. The reminder that he wasn't facing this alone. They arrived at the courthouse to find the Thorntons already there, a well-dressed couple in their 50s, Martha Thornton in expensive fabrics and William Thornton in a fine suit. They looked prosperous and respectable, and everything that Bear wasn't. Eleanor saw Bear's shoulders slump slightly, saw him comparing himself and finding himself wanting. Stand tall, she whispered to him. You're worth 10 of them. The bailiff called them in, and they entered the courtroom together, 3 people bound by love and choice, about to fight for their right to be a family. The battle had begun, and Eleanor prayed with everything in her that love would be enough. The hearing lasted 3 hours. 3 hours that felt like a lifetime. The Thorntons' lawyer was smooth and practiced, painting a picture of Samuel's life with Bear as one of deprivation and instability. He emphasized the transient nature of trapping work, the isolation of mountain living, the lack of proper schooling and social opportunities. He made Bear sound like a well-meaning but inadequate father, someone whose love wasn't enough to overcome his practical limitations. Then he presented the Thorntons' offer, a permanent home in Pine Ridge, enrollment in the town school, social standing, stability, everything a growing boy needed. Martha Thornton testified about their comfortable home, their standing in the community, their desire to honor their late daughter's memory by raising her son properly. It was compelling. Even Eleanor, knowing the truth of what they'd built in that cabin, could see how it sounded to outsiders. On paper, the Thorntons could offer more, much more, but then it was their turn. Mr. Harris, their lawyer, called Bear to testify first. Bear spoke simply and honestly about his life with Samuel, about Mary's death, and his determination to honor her memory by raising their son with love and integrity. He talked about the skills he'd taught Samuel, the values they shared, the bond between them. "Can you give him everything the Thorntons can?" the Thorntons' lawyer asked on cross-examination. "No," Bear admitted. "I can't give him a big house or fancy clothes or social connections. But I can give him something more important. I can give him a father's love every single day. I can give him the knowledge that he's wanted, that he matters, that his happiness is the most important thing in the world to me. Can the Thorntons promise that?" Then Eleanor testified. She spoke about Samuel's remarkable progress in his lessons, his bright mind and gentle heart. She talked about the family they'd become, the home they'd built together. She explained how Samuel had transformed from a quiet, fearful child into a confident, joyful boy who knew he was loved. "Miss Hartwell," the judge interrupted, "forgive me, but aren't you essentially admitting that an unmarried woman and an unrelated man are raising a child together? Some might consider that irregular." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "Your Honor, what's irregular is that a child who has a loving, devoted father might be taken from him because that father doesn't have enough money. What's irregular is that people who rejected this child for 7 years suddenly want him now that he's thriving. Family isn't always about blood or legal documents. Sometimes family is about the people who choose each other, who show up every day, who fight for each other. That's what we are. That's what we've built. And with respect, Your Honor, there's nothing irregular about love." The courtroom was silent after that. Even the Thorntons' lawyer seemed uncertain how to respond. Finally, Mr. Harris called Samuel to testify. The boy walked to the witness chair with his head high, though Eleanor could see his hands trembling. The judge spoke to him gently, explaining that he just wanted to understand what Samuel wanted, what would make him happy. "Samuel," the judge said, "you've heard what everyone has said today. The Thorntons can offer you many advantages: education, a comfortable home, opportunities. Your father and Miss Hartwell offer something different. If it were up to you, where would you want to live?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the drawing he'd made at Christmas, the one showing their family, the one labeled "Our Family" in his careful handwriting. "Your Honor," Samuel said, his voice clear despite his fear, "I know the Thorntons can give me things my pa can't, but they can't give me what I need most. They can't give me my pa. They can't give me Miss Eleanor. They can't give me the feeling I get when I wake up in the morning and know that the people around me want me there, not because they have to, but because they choose to. That's what family means to me. Not a big house or nice clothes. Just belonging. Just being chosen." He held up the drawing. "I drew this at Christmas. It's us, our family, and I don't want any other family. I just want this one." Eleanor saw tears on the judge's face, saw Martha Thornton wipe her eyes, saw Bear gripping the table in front of him, overcome with emotion. The judge was silent for a long time after Samuel returned to sit between Bear and Eleanor. Finally, he spoke. "This court has heard compelling arguments from both sides. The Thorntons can indeed offer material advantages and social opportunities. But this court must also consider what truly serves a child's best interests. And after hearing today's testimony, particularly from the boy himself, it's clear to me that Samuel McCain is not a child in need of rescue. He's a child who has found his home, his family, his place in the world. To remove him from that would be cruel and unjust." Eleanor felt Bear's hand grip hers so tightly it hurt. "Therefore," the judge continued, "this court denies the Thorntons' petition for guardianship. Samuel McCain will remain in the custody of his father, James McCain. However," he looked at Bear seriously, "I'm ordering regular check-ins by the county to ensure Samuel continues to receive adequate education and care. And I'm strongly suggesting that you formalize Miss Hartwell's role in his upbringing." This arrangement you've created, while unconventional, seems to be working. But it needs legal standing to protect all parties involved. The judge banged his gavel. Case dismissed. This family stays together. The words echoed in the courtroom. This family stays together. Eleanor felt Bear pull her and Samuel into his arms, felt the three of them holding each other tight, years of fear and uncertainty finally releasing. They'd won. Against all odds, despite having less money and less status, and less of everything except love, they'd won. Outside the courthouse, Martha Thornton approached them. Eleanor tensed, but the older woman's face was soft, sad, accepting. "He looks like her," she said quietly, looking at Samuel. "Like our Mary, and he sounds happy when he talks. That's what she would have wanted. For him to be happy," she paused. "We were wrong, you know. About you, Mr. McCain, about blaming you for her death. Grief makes people say terrible things, do terrible things. I hope perhaps someday you might let us know him, not as guardians, just as family who wants to be part of his life." Bear looked at Samuel, who nodded. "We can arrange visits," Bear said. "On our terms, when Samuel's comfortable with it." Martha nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. That's more than we deserve." As they rode back to the cabin in the wagon, none of them spoke much. They were exhausted, wrung out, but victorious. Samuel sat between Bear and Eleanor, and eventually he fell asleep, his head on Eleanor's shoulder, his hand holding his father's. "We did it," Bear said softly. "We actually did it." "We told the truth," Eleanor replied. And the truth was enough. When they arrived home, Bear lifted Samuel carefully from the wagon and carried him to his bed. The boy stirred but didn't wake, secure in his father's arms, secure in the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged. That evening, after Samuel was settled and sleeping peacefully, Bear began working on something at the table. Eleanor watched as he carved letters into a piece of smooth pine, his hands sure and steady. When he finished, he held it up, a sign that read Hartwell McCain Homestead, for above the door, he explained. "To make it official. To show anyone who passes by that this is a home, a real home, for a real family." The next morning he hung it, and Eleanor stood back to admire it. 3 names, one from the life she'd lost, one from the life she'd found, joined together in a new beginning. Spring came eventually, as it always did in the mountains. The snow melted, the rivers ran high with runoff, and the world turned green again. Bear made short trapping runs, always returning within days to find Eleanor and Samuel waiting, to find home waiting. Samuel thrived, his reading now at a level that amazed even Eleanor. He was growing taller, stronger, more confident. And more than that, he was happy, deeply, genuinely happy in a way children should be when they're loved and secure. One evening in early May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Samuel said, "Miss Eleanor, I was thinking about what the judge said, about formalizing things, about making it official." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked. Samuel looked at her seriously. "I mean, you're already like a mother to me. You teach me and take care of me and love me. Pa's my father. But you're my mother now, not replacing my real mama, but being the mother I have now. And I was wondering, could I maybe call you Ma? If that would be all right?" Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. She'd never had children, had never heard anyone call her Ma, and now this beautiful boy, this child she'd come to love as her own, was offering her that gift. "I would be honored," she managed to say. "So honored, Samuel." "Then that's settled," Samuel said, satisfied. He looked at Bear, then at Eleanor, then out at the mountains. "We're a real family now. Officially." Bear reached over and took Eleanor's hand, and she squeezed back, overwhelmed with gratitude for the strange path that had brought them all here. A storm, a knock on the door, a decision to let strangers in, and everything had changed, not replaced what was lost. Nothing could do that, but created something new, something precious, something worth fighting for. The mountains stood eternal around them, witness to their story, guardian of their home. And inside that home, 3 hearts that had been broken found healing in each other. 3 souls who'd been lost found their way to belonging. 3 people who'd been alone found family. And that, Eleanor thought, as the last light faded from the sky and they rose together to go inside, was more than enough. It was everything. It was home.